bring us the message this morning.
Thank you, Wilmer. And I'll echo a lot of what Wilmer said. Welcome to everyone joining us online, and welcome to especially Alan for being here, and Joe being back, and Warren and Mark. It's great to be with you, and it's good to see you. And hopefully you picked up on, we're going to be talking a lot about grace through our worship. As Mike said, the old EC's hymn, Wonderful Grace of Jesus. And that's what we're going to be talking about this morning, diving into the grace of Jesus Christ. And to do that, I actually want to start out by taking us back to the early 1770s. And back at this time, more and more colonists became convinced that Parliament intended to take away their freedom. In fact, the Americans saw a pattern of increasing oppression and corruption happening all around the world. Parliament was determined, though, that these unruly American subjects needed to heal. They needed to be put in their place. So Britain began to prepare for war in early 1775, and the first fighting actually broke out in April. In August, the king declared the colonists to be in a state of open and avowed rebellion. For the first time, many colonists began to seriously consider cutting ties with Britain. The publication of Thomas Paine's stirring pamphlet, Common Sense, in early 1776, lit a fire under the previously unthinkable idea. The movement for independence was now in full swing. So the colonists elected delegates to attend a Continental Congress that eventually became the governing body of the Union during the Revolution. Its second meeting convened in Philadelphia in 1775. The delegates to Congress adopted strict rules of secrecy to protect the cause of American liberty, but also to protect their own lives. In less than a year, most of the delegates abandoned hope of ever being reconciled with Britain. And so on June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution that these united colonies are of right and ought to be free and independent states. They appointed a committee of 5 to write an announcement explaining the reasons for independence. Thomas Jefferson, who chaired the committee and had established himself as a bold and talented political writer, wrote the first draft. It was then on July 11, 1776, Jefferson holed up in his Philadelphia boarding house and he began to write. He borrowed freely from existing documents like the Virginia Declaration of Rights and incorporated accepted ideals of the Enlightenment. Jefferson later explained that he was not striving for originality of principle or of sentiment. Instead, he hoped that his words were an expression of the American mind. In less than 3 weeks after he began, he presented his draft to Congress. Jefferson, however, was not pleased when Congress, in his words, mangled his composition by cutting and changing much of his carefully chosen wording, and he was especially sorry they removed the part blaming King George III for the slave trade, although even Jefferson knew that this wasn't the time to deal with that issue. Nevertheless, on July 2nd, 1776, Congress voted to declare independence. 2 days later, it ratified the text of the Declaration. John Dunlap, official printer of Congress, worked through the night to set the Declaration in type and print, and approximately 200 copies were distributed. These copies, known as the Dunlap broadsides, were sent to various committees, assemblies, and commanders of the Continental troops. The Dunlap broadsides were not signed, but John Hancock's famous signature did appear in large type at the bottom. One copy crossed the Atlantic, reaching King George III months later, and the official British response scolded the misguided Americans and their extravagant and inadmissible claim of independency. Of course, you have probably figured out by now that this is the short history of what went into writing what we know today as our Declaration of Independence. The document and its principles which our nation has been established and built upon all the way since 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and given by their Creator certain rights. That's the principles that we have been built upon. Now, I say all that not to give you a U.S. history lesson, but to equate and to illustrate that Acts 15, what Wilmer just read for us this morning, is the church's own Declaration of Independence. That Acts 15, and most importantly, the decision that it recounts, is the foundation that the early church was built upon and that the church continues to be built upon to this day. As we've been studying for the past several weeks now from the book of Acts, you've probably seen that it's been a bit of an up and down ride for the early church and the apostles and the early believers. The early church has faced persecution, it's faced ridicule, it's faced opposition, it's even faced imprisonment and the public death of one of its leaders. Yet through it all, Christ continued to build his church. The church was growing and it was multiplying. And like with any growing movement, whether it's in the church or in establishing a young nation, at some point that movement will have to define what they are going to stand for, what they are going to be built upon. Because as movements grow and continue, it can be easy for the founding principles to be, as Jefferson thought some of his principles in the Declaration of Independence, it'd be easy for those principles to be mangled, for it to become blurry. It can be easy for what the movement is really all about to become obscure. And as I hope you noticed as I gave you that quick history lesson from the writing of the Declaration of Independence, those words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," those words and principles that this country has been built upon, that document, that foundation, it didn't come together in a day, and it wasn't crafted in isolation. It was the work of several years with the influence of several men and principles behind it. Eventually, leaders had to sit down and agree upon what it is this young nation or this young movement was going to be all about, what it was going to be built upon. And that's exactly what we see happening here in Acts 15. The church has gone through this movement, and throughout this movement and growth, there's been this huge question hanging over the young church. It's how exactly is it that one is saved? How exactly does one receive salvation? What is required for salvation? And that is really the question that the early church is wrestling with here. The question specifically that Wilmer read is, do you need to be circumcised to receive salvation? But it's really more specifically, do you need to keep the law of Moses to be saved? Do you need to have faith in Jesus Christ plus something else to be saved? Or is it by faith alone in the grace of Jesus Christ? Is it by faith plus something that you are saved, or by faith alone? The context, and right before where Wilmer started to read in Acts 15 and in chapter 14, that ends with Paul and Barnabas. They're preaching to Gentiles in Antioch. And in their preaching, Gentiles are coming to faith. Verse 27 of chapter 14 reads, "On arriving there, they," Paul and Barnabas, "gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles." In verse 1 then of chapter 15, certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers that unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. See, God had opened the door to the Gentiles by only their putting faith in his Son, Jesus Christ. Now certain people said that that's not enough. You not only have to have faith in God and in Jesus Christ, but you also need to keep the law of Moses, that men needed to be circumcised. And Luke records for us that this undoubtedly brought Paul and Barnabas into, quote, a sharp dispute with these certain men. And again, I don't think it's possible to overstate what a huge moment this is in church history. How, if things could have gone differently, how church history would have been altered. The church is wrestling with the question, is it, as Paul and Barnabas are arguing, by faith alone in the grace of Jesus Christ that all men and women, regardless of their background, regardless of their race or ethnicity, regardless of gender or any other human classification, is it by faith alone and grace alone that we are saved? Or is it by faith and grace in Jesus Christ plus something else? In this case, it's the keeping of the law that we are saved. If we were to ask this question today, I think we would ask it as, is it in faith alone in the grace of Jesus Christ that we are saved? Or is it by faith plus God's grace plus works that we are saved? Is it that by faith and by earning our position before God that we are saved? Now, before we answer those questions and see the answer that the group gathered in Acts 15 came to, there are a few foundational principles in church life and how we can interact with one another that we can glean from and apply to our own church life. The first is to look at how the young church handled this colossal watershed moment, this literal history-altering decision that they had before them. They handled it together and in unity. Because it would have been really easy for the apostles, for Paul and Barnabas say, and the believers to take their faith in the grace alone of Jesus Christ and sort of take that ball and just go home and lead the Jews to their own. It would have also been easy for the Jews to take their faith and the maintaining of the law and go home with that ball and just each side to fend for themselves. And if that would have happened, we would have ended up with a church that you earned your position before God through faith and the maintaining of the law, and a church that was just about faith and the grace of Jesus Christ. And that sort of I will take my ball and go home mindset, it's very prevalent in our world. It's undoubtedly made its way into the church. For many people, the moment that someone's going to look at them wrong in church, we're going to take our ball and we're going to go down the street to church. Yet then look at this vast dispute that the church was facing. Yet nobody took their ball and went home. They, in fact, gathered the church together and worked through this huge decision in unity and came to a decision in unison. What we have here in Acts 15 is really the first in what would become a long line of church meetings. And in doing so, they set the template for how our church meetings, our church interactions, our interactions with other members of the body of Christ should look like, what the ideal church gathering should be like. And this is important because most of us have probably been in church meetings or in unhealthy, ununified churches. Of course, not here. That's never happened here. So, Mary Jane, since you've grown up here, you've never experienced it. But the rest of us who've gone to maybe some other churches have probably experienced unhealthy, ununified churches or church gatherings. And it's actually crazy what we will let divide us, even in the church, and then how we will try to handle that division. I remember being a part of a church that was actually feuding over who had access to the church copier. And much like what we have here in Acts 15, we had two very opinionated sides. One that wanted the church's copier to be under lock and key with only certain people having access to it. And then there was the other side that wanted the copier to be accessible to all in the church. And we literally spent several months as a church, a leadership team, arguing over who should have access to this copier. Now, this was back at just the beginning of my time of being active in the church and in church leadership. So I went into this time excited about these meetings, thinking, oh, we're going to spend all of our time in these meetings thinking about how we can share the gospel of Jesus Christ. These meetings will be all about how we can grow the church in number and grow people closer to God or draw people closer to God. Instead, here I found myself in the middle of arguments about how who had access to a copier. It's crazy what we will fight about, even in church, isn't it? Yet I think one of the things that Acts 15 teaches us is if we are going to have a, quote, sharp dispute, as we have here, let's make that sharp dispute count. Let's make it about the gospel. Let's dispute about how it is that people are going to be saved. And as we've studied through Acts 15 the past several weeks, you've probably noticed that this isn't the first bump in the road that the young church has faced. Yet when it came to something that mattered as much as how it is that people are saved, what did the church do? They took the time to stop, to give each party the chance to state their case in harmony with the body of Christ. And when we have sharp disputes, we need to do the same thing. We need to make sure that the items are central to the gospel and that all sides are heard, and we work to form a decision and an outcome that's in unity with the body of Christ. Now, going back to my dispute over the church copier, at like meeting 3 or 4 of this argument over the copier, I was seated in a meeting spot that I could look out towards the church's bell tower, out the window, and the bell tower on this summer evening had this beautiful backdrop of a summer sunset. And I found myself paying much more attention out the window to the beautiful sunset than I was to paying attention to the bickering over the church copier. And as I did this, eventually myself and the gentleman sitting beside me, we both realized that we were tuned out of the meeting and plugged into the sunset more than the issue at hand. And as the sun was setting and the colors were changing and the light was reflecting off the church bell tower, we found ourselves sort of silently motioning to one another, look at that, check that color out, check that reflection out. Now, was this the best way for me and this other church leader to handle this situation and this conflict? No, of course not. We both, even though thinking that this was a ridiculous argument to be having and sort of a waste of time for the church to be arguing over, our decision to just merely tune it out and turn a blind eye towards the conflict that was dividing the church wasn't the best way to handle the moment. I mean, can you imagine what would have happened if the leaders here in Acts 15 would have done that? Luke records for us that all of the big shot leaders of the day were there at this first council meeting of the church. We have Paul, we have Barnabas, of course our pal Peter is going to be there. We have the elders and the apostles, the Pharisees are there arguing for circumcision. Everyone is there. And even James was there. And this is James, the brother of our Lord. And James at this point has become the leader of the church in Jerusalem. This is the same James that writes the book that bears his name in the New Testament. And that book is written to a church in Jerusalem that is facing persecution. James is the authority figure. James is the leader. He is the one in this moment in the church in Jerusalem that everyone will look to for guidance in moments like this. Now, can you imagine if James would have followed in my footsteps and sat in this meeting watching the sunset over the temple instead of engaging in the discussion? Praise God that James didn't do that. Instead, as one with authority, James, with a leadership position in the church, he allows the discussion to happen, each side to take its place and to state its case. He allows Peter to share what God has done through him in relationship to the Gentiles, what Don led us through a couple weeks ago in his experience with Cornelius, the Gentile coming to faith. He allows Paul and Barnabas to share the signs and wonders that God had done through their ministry and how the Gentiles were coming to faith in their ministry. And Luke records often that phrase, signs and wonders, throughout Acts. And for Luke and for the early church, that phrase is very important, and thus it's very important for us. Because signs and wonders are the confirmation that what we're reading in Acts, for the early church, what Paul and Barnabas and Peter were reporting, signs and wonders were the confirmation that this is the work of God, that this truly is the will of God. In this case, that it was indeed the will of God that these Gentiles be saved through faith alone in Jesus Christ, through Jesus Christ's grace alone, whether they have kept the law of Moses, whether they are circumcised or not. And we get to verse 13, when we read that the group gathered there had become silent after hearing of the signs and wonders that Peter, Paul, and Barnabas had recounted for them. And there is great significance in that silence. Because you'll notice the bickering, if the silence is there, of course the bickering has stopped. It seems that all of a sudden, all that were gathered there were realizing that what Peter, that what Paul, that what Barnabas were saying really was the truth. That because of Jesus Christ, salvation was now available to every person, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of ethnicity or your prior religious affiliation, whether you are circumcised or not, your political standing, the amount of wealth that you have, none of that mattered anymore. Now, through the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, salvation was available to every single person from every single nation. And the best part was, it was available without the yoke and without the burden which was the law of Moses. And the silence that Luke records in verse 13 is a really beautiful moment that should not be glossed over when we come to this passage. This is the moment that all that were gathered there are realizing what Jesus Christ has done for every one of them and the implications for them. That they no longer had to maintain that heavy burden of the law of Moses, its list of do's and don'ts and sacrifices. That list of do's and don'ts and sacrifices that, as Peter correctly says, they could never maintain anyway. Throughout the generations, they never kept the law to perfection anyway. And the silence of verse 13 is individuals realizing that that burden, which they could not carry anyway, for how to receive salvation, it was truly no longer theirs to carry anymore. That salvation and forgiveness of sins were available to all people through the burden that Jesus Christ carried as he went to the cross. That by faith in the grace of Jesus Christ, truly all men and women are now created equal and are able to stand before a right and perfect God. Circumcised or not, the grace of Jesus Christ that surpasses all understanding is available to all people. And coming to that realization is something that should certainly cause us all to go into silence out of the awe and wonder of what Jesus Christ has done for us. And out of that silence, I think it is so cool to see what happens next. James, again, the authority figure in this moment, he stands up. James breaks that silence. And he confirms all that Peter, Paul, and Barnabas had just revealed to be true. But James also affirms that all that the prophets have spoken has been established, has been fulfilled in Jesus Christ as well. James quotes from Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, which is God telling his people that he himself will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down. He will rebuild the ruins, so that all humanity, even the Gentiles, even the rejected in society, can call on and find salvation in the name of Jesus Christ. What I think that is so cool about this silent amazement that Luke records here in verse 13, and that James follows with a reminder of the promise God made to his people, of how he will rebuild the fallen house of David so that all can call on the Lord, is think way back to the Old Testament, and the prophet Samuel records for us in 2 Samuel 6. You can turn there now. I won't read it, but I'll just summarize it for you. It's on page 244 in your Pew Bibles. I'd encourage you to take the time to read 2 Samuel 6 and 7 this week. But I'll just, again, use a summary for our purposes today. What's happening in 2 Samuel chapter 6, the circumstances are, that house of David, it's really at its peak in this moment. God's chosen people, Israel, their King David, they are surrounded by peace on every side. The Ark of the Covenant, which was God's dwelling place on earth at this time, it was now residing in Jerusalem. King David has his house of cedar, his palace was established. And we find it starting in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 2. King David says, this isn't right. He says, how is it that I'm living in this beautiful house of cedar, and yet God is dwelling in a tent? And David, I think with excellent intention, says to the prophet Nathan, he says, I'm going to build God a house. I'm going to build God a temple, a house of cedar to dwell in himself. And to which the prophet of God, Nathan, apparently forgetting what it meant to be a prophet of God, says, without consulting God, he just says, sounds good to me, David. Do whatever you think is best. Do whatever you want. Now God barely lets the prophet Nathan get out of the presence of David before he says, stop. Go back and tell David that not only do I not need him, nor do I want him to build me a house, but in fact the reverse is going to happen. God says, I'm going to build David a house for him. And I just want to read a short portion of what God says through Nathan to David. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you, David. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I, the Lord, will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But God says, my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you, David. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. These verses are God's promise to David and thus to all mankind. Way back in 2 Samuel, that he would do precisely what the early church had just realized God had accomplished for them. That God would raise up his own son out out of the line of David in human flesh and blood, and that Son would establish an eternal kingdom. And that eternal kingdom would have open doors to all humanity through the grace of this Son. And to every person, from every nation, this kingdom would be open. And as we talked about at length earlier, the realization of the fulfillment of this promise by God through Jesus Christ caused all that were gathered here in Acts 15 to go into quiet reflection about what God had done for them. About how God had rebuilt the house of David. How God had fulfilled his promise to all mankind, to all people. And look at verse 18 of 2 Samuel 7. What was David's response to just hearing this promise that God made to him and all mankind? Verse 18 says, Then King David, mighty King David, went in and sat before the Lord. King David, again the warrior that he was, and just hearing of God's promise, could do nothing else but just go into the presence of God and sit in silence, in reverence at what God had just promised that he would do for him and all humankind. David was shocked, he was stunned at the greatness of what God had promised for him to do. And David couldn't do anything but go before the Lord and sit in silence, reflecting upon what God had just promised him he was going to do. It is the same reaction that the church had here in Acts 15, upon realizing that God had fulfilled this promise. That through Jesus Christ, God had in fact established this eternal kingdom. But as if that wasn't good enough, that eternal kingdom was now open to the Gentiles just as much as it was to the Jew. This kingdom was open just as much to man as it was to women. That it's open just as much to whites as it is to blacks. That it's open just as much to the Hindu as it is to the Muslim. That it's open to the Republican just as much as it is to the Democrat. It's open to the poor as much as the rich. It's open to the ones that seemingly always have it all together just as much as it is to the ones who always seem like their world is falling apart. God has made the way through faith in the grace of Jesus Christ that all of these categories of people, the saint and the sinner alike, and any other classification of people that we can come up with, can be a part of this kingdom that is without end and is perfect. And that way is Jesus Christ. And through it and his grace, all can receive salvation. That is what all those gathered here in Acts 15 stood united in. And it's what they share with Christians around the world and through the generations all the way to today. We are all united in the grace of our Savior, Jesus Christ. For the church, that is the foundation upon which we build. A grace that is found in only one place and in only one name, which of course is Christ Jesus. At the end of the day, we're probably going to have our disagreements. We might argue over meaningless things at the end of the day, like who has access to the church copier. By the way, I think we should lock up the church copier, but no. Still, if we follow the example that Luke records for us here in Acts 15, we should be able to come through anything united in one thing, the grace of our Savior, Jesus Christ. And we should show that grace to others. I want to close our time here with two questions that I hope we ponder in the days and the weeks ahead. The first one is this. Have we had moments like King David had? Have we had moments like the church here in Acts 15 had? Moments where we are completely taken aback, where we are completely awestruck, even dumbfounded, speechless at what Jesus Christ has done for us. Moments where we simply cannot believe that Jesus Christ would show sinners like us grace and forgiveness without us doing one thing to deserve it. Because we should have moments like this on a regular basis. Moments where we are just amazed by the goodness and the love and the grace offered by our loving Savior, Jesus Christ. Moments where we are brought to silence, maybe even brought to our knees, by the grace that Jesus Christ has shown us and he offers to all humanity. Now, if we can answer yes to that question, church, it leads us to question number 2. Are we making it easy for those who have yet to experience the grace of Jesus Christ to do so? As Adam pointed out on Thursday night, and I'll invite you to check out YouTube or Facebook for Adam's message, God led Adam to Acts chapter 15, verse 19, without even knowing. We're in a study of Acts, and we were in Acts 15, so this is certainly a message that God wants us to hear. But Adam pointed out in verse 19, where James, still speaking to the church, James says, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God." As individuals who have experienced the grace of Jesus Christ and are united in that grace, the question we need to answer is, are we helping others turn to God and experience that same grace? Are we making others' road to this grace easy, or are we making it more difficult than it needs to be? Because James and those gathered here in Acts 15 decided that it was best for the church to not make it harder for others to turn to God than it has to be. And as our church partners with groups like Adam and the Factory, as we reach out to the world through our online ministry and through our movie nights, I believe that God will use this body. He's going to use us in our church to help people turn to Him and to discover and experience His grace. Now, as this happens, we are going to encounter people who are different than us by all of those human classifications that I rattled off earlier. They will hold some different traditions than us, but as long as those traditions aren't in contrast to the gospel of Jesus Christ, that's okay. The question for us is, and this is as much for me as any one of you hearing this, but are we going to let those non-gospel centered, those non-gospel related issues cause us to make it more difficult for those who are turning to God to do so? Or are we going to be there to enable them and make it as easy as possible for them to experience and live in the grace of Jesus Christ? I pray that we choose to follow the early church's example and not be stumbling blocks to those who are turning to God. Hear this and think about this. Think about our witness as the church. And when I say as the church, I'm talking about Pequea EC, and I'm talking about the capital C church of the world. In a nation, as the church, living in a nation that is right now literally divided over every single issue that comes up. As the church, living in a country that has seemingly lost track of the truths that it started out built upon. What if the church remembered, and most importantly, I have this in all capital letters, practiced the truths that we hold self-evident? That we are united in the name and in the grace of our glorious Savior, Jesus Christ. Think about how significant could be our witness, could be our impact in the world if we stood united in that grace of Jesus Christ and put it into practice. What would be the results? Well, the great thing is we don't have to think about too hard what that would look like and what the results of standing united in the grace of Jesus Christ as a church would be. We have to look no further than Acts chapter 16, verses 4 through 5. Verses 4 says, as they, the apostles, Paul and Barnabas, traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So they took this message of being saved by grace alone in Jesus Christ, by faith alone in Jesus Christ. They took this to the church, and look what happened in verse 5. It says, so the churches were